Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Obsessive Compulsive Gaming. I am the Obsessive Compulsive Gamer, and this is my little look back to an underappreciated, underrated, underwear-branded Resident Evil game. That game being Resident Evil, the Umbrella Chronicles. So dear viewer, if you wouldn't mind, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. So you might be saying to yourself, dear viewer, Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles? What the hell is that? OCG, you oh so talented chap who likes to occasionally attend swingers' nights dressed up as Albert Wesker. I'm so glad you asked, dear viewer. This is an on-rails light gun shooter video game thingamajig that originally released for the Nintendo Wii in 2007. A year I remember fondly as the year I played a hell of a lot of video games. But for all of you PlayStation and Xbox fanboys and fangirls out there, you'll be glad to hear that the game was remastered and released for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in 2012. And this game is essentially a retelling, rehashing, really nice branded underpants version of Resident Evil Remake, Resident Evil 0, and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. We also get a whole new story taking place in Russia starring Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield, as well as some extra stages featuring Rebecca Chambers, Albert Wesker, and even that hunky fellow called, well, Hunk. Not being the biggest fan of Resident Evil 0, it is quite nice to play through a slightly condensed, rewritten version of that game. In fact, in that game in particular, Umbrella Chronicles actually improves on some of the storytelling. For example, we don't see Marcus as the anime, long-haired, younger version of himself like we do in the original game, which personally I've always found to be completely and utterly ridiculous. Ridiculous! Instead, here we just get the very much undead version of Marcus, who then turns into that big giant leech monster thingamajig, which I think is much better. And of course, the Resident Evil section being far shorter than the original game, you can probably imagine that I much prefer it. Rather like how I deal with my visits to my local brothel. Get in, do what I need to do, and get out before my wife notices. The Resident Evil and Resident Evil Remake sections do pretty much reuse a lot of assets from their respective games that originally released on the GameCube. But the Resident Evil Remake section has the added bonus of trimming away some of the superfluous characters, and instead letting us go through the events of that story with both Chris and Jill as a duo. Something, of course, you'll know if you played the original game or the remake, you'll know that you can't do that. You have to either play as Jill or as Chris. And apart from a little bit towards the end of the original game, they don't actually share any game time whatsoever. The Resident Evil 3 section, though, is fundamentally, essentially a kind of, sort of, remake of sorts, having no GameCube version to draw assets from. So we get new cutscenes here, we get a rewritten, albeit very rushed version of the events of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and it sadly butchers most of the events of that original game, sadly, but it is nice to see a kind of, sort of prototype for what would later become the official Resident Evil 3 remake. But most of the fun in this game, for those who haven't played this game anyway, but consider themselves to be Resident Evil fans, is going to be found in the new story here. The one I mentioned before that takes place in Russia, for the climactic showdown against Talos. Talos. No, I'm sure it's Talos. Or is it Talos? Never mind. And in fact, several of Albert Wesker's stages expand on the bad guy that we meet in this Russian set story. And in fact, Albert Wesker gets some exclusive boss fights that aren't present in the other sections of the game. Like for example, in the Resident Evil Remake section, we get to see Albert Wesker encounter Lisa Trevor. And I must say, it is very nice to get to play as Rebecca Chambers and see what she's up to during the events of the Resident Evil Remake. This game does a wonderful job of condensing the events of those games, as well as adding a lot of new material for those of us who are very used to playing through Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil Remake, and Resident Evil 3. And being a massive fan of on-rail light gun shooters myself, it's incredibly enjoyable being able to play through a light gun version of Resident Evil. And this game would be followed by a kind of sort of sequel, which, spoiler alert, is definitely the better of the two games. But we'll talk about that when we get to it. That game being Resident Evil The Dark Side Chronicles. If you have your Nintendo Wii in storage, or if you've been neglecting it for some time, you can pick up copies of Resident Evil Umbrella Chronicles very cheap. And of course, you can use the Wii remote to kind of stand in for the light gun. There's lots of attachments you can still get that you were able to insert your Wii controller into and fashion a pretty realistic light gun, if I don't say so myself. But if you choose to play the HD version, on PlayStation 3 that is, you can take advantage of the PlayStation 3's Move controller. But regardless of how you choose to play this game, if you consider yourself to be a Resident Evil fan and this game just flew over your head, or flew over your house, or flew towards you, smacked you in the head, and that made you go, "Ooh, that hurt. I'm definitely not playing that game now," you might want to reconsider that stance and give Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles a go for yourself. I personally don't think you'll regret it. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. A little video on Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles. If you enjoyed this little video of mine, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. If you haven't enjoyed it, well then feel free to give me a thumbs down. But please remember the single most important thing I always tell you, dear viewer, and that is to always stay obsessed with gaming. Are you still here? Oh, you must have really enjoyed this video then. In that case, you had better subscribe to the channel and check out our other content. Otherwise, you're a booby pants, and no one wants to be a booby pants.